Okay. Michael Fromm's editor was good for his word. He gave Michael the opportunity for a five-part series, all of which started on the front page of the Washington Post, and they were all about Warsaw. And the outside world really didn't have much of an idea of the condition that Poland in general, but Warsaw in particular, was in until this was the first sort of outside world exposure. Okay, Prague #3 and William Jakeman. Now, Jakeman was the one that took the first Warsaw flight in, and we suspect that he was with the OSS. And the Prague 3 flight had to force land in Portland, Maine, on its way out because the weather was so severe, the radio equipment went down, and they didn't dare cross the Atlantic without it. So they they waited for help to come to fix the radios, and they got some press coverage while they were there. And I got these press clippings from his son, from Jakeman's son, but it identified these pilots. And I had their names and no photos, so it was a huge help to understand who I had here. And I'm going to show you that footage again from the United Nations, and I apologize in advance. I had misidentified the flight. The flight that you're about to see was Jakeman and his crew, not the crew that's listed on the video. But this is the one that came from the Steven Spielberg Film and Video Archive. A friend that was doing research for me found it. And I'll leave it, not touch it. Cameron, thank you. This has no voice, so I'm going to tell you a few things while it goes. Obviously, that's the DC-3, and she didn't make the trip. It was June, not May, of '46 that this flight was conducted. And I have been working with the Archive of the United Nations. They have been unbelievably helpful and have given me access to documents in which I learned more about the war relief effort. And the hatching eggs became a matter of some disagreement, because the original agreement was that hatching eggs would be brought as unhatched fertilized eggs. And I have documentation that talks about the fact that without asking the Polish mission, somebody in the States decided to send them baby chicks. And there's a correspondence back and forth that I have a copy of that says, baby chicks, when they get cold, most of them die, and if they don't die, they will die later of something that has affected their system. So sending live baby chicks is not the thing to do. And let me interrupt myself here for a second. Let me see if they're going to disembark again. The cameraman had them get off and then get off again, and he had them come down facing outward so that he could see them better on the camera. Those are the crates. Got our name stamped on the side. There's our logo. But so this correspondence is going back and forth about the hatching eggs versus the chicks. And finally, the man in the Polish mission sends a letter and says, I'll make a suggestion. Since you've made the decision without the input of the poultry experts, why don't you send the people over here, have them fly with the baby chicks, and then be responsible for them once they're on the ground, so that they can understand why we don't want the baby chicks, why we want them to come in eggshells so that they can be incubated. It was such a huge undertaking. And nobody had ever done anything on that scale before. So I'm not telling this story in a manner of pointing finger. It's just the size of the mission had to have been just unbelievable. So this is, now they're taking the crates away. Watch this lorry, because in a moment there are going to be a group of men that are going to walk in front of the camera. And they're prisoners of war. Now they take the eggs to the hatchery. This will be over momentarily. And they're very carefully removing them from our crates and putting them into the incubator type things. And you'll see, I think the cameraman did the same thing to these folks that are carrying the crates as he did to the crew. He had them come through a couple of different times so that he could get good footage. But you're going to see a stand with baby chicks in it, and they're live, and they're all yellow, and I can tell they're yellow even though this is black and white. And they're probably the chicks that we brought over in Flight 1 and 2. So it's sort of an interesting continuum of the story. And the other last comment about this, one of the communications back and forth, this all was by cable, the gentleman in Poland said, and you know, you've sent these chicks over by airplane against our request. We really, because they were coming by ship, and evidently it was a better mode of transportation. That may be why we only did 5 flights instead of more than that. Okay, let me see if I can. So that's the end of that. So William Jakeman, who was the captain on this Prague 3 flight, his flight engineer was George Canick, and Jakeman's son was also became a commercial airline pilot, and he flew with the same flight engineer decades later. When the man signed on, he said, "Canick, that sounds so familiar." And they finally matched their notes, and he had flown with young Bill's father. Small world again. Thomas Cowart. He flew, and this is the last flight. This is Athens. This is August of '46. And this was the baby cattle flight. And this young man, Gus Kalos, was of Greek descent, and he was chosen from his high school to be a handler on this flight. He was part of the Future Farmers of America group. And Thomas Cowart has a story for you. It's very brief. Cameron. I'm afraid to push it again. I'll push it again. Nope. Wait a minute. You got to hear this. Cameron. Cowart. Nothing there. All right, I will tell you what he said. Thomas was a farm boy, and he had not seen the cattle being loaded on the airplane because he was, as he said, making sure the airplane was ready to fly. But he said to me, "I just don't understand. I would have thought those cows would have been in crates." And he was right, but they put them in the crates after they went up the gangway, after they did the publicity stunt. And there's Gus cleaning up the mess. And here they are on the ground in Athens. Can you see the 3 babies with their faces? They're standing between the crew members. Thomas Cowart was a flight engineer. Because when he joined the Army Air Corps, they found out that he used to fix tractors. They turned him into an aircraft mechanic, and then from that he became a flight mechanic and a flight engineer. And then he told me that the number 3 engine on the airplane in Athens didn't sound right, so he got a big ladder and climbed up there and pulled the cowling off by himself and changed all the spark plugs in the middle of the night. And I like to tell the story because he told it to me, and also it's just a reflection of his character. These are his daughters, Joy and Angie, and we're sisters, don't you know? They're great folks. Okay, we're coming toward the end here. This is the DC-4 that flew the Athens trip, and it was readied for flight in a place called Sebring, Florida, which had been Hendricks Air Force Base. And it was in the process of going from Hendricks to civilian life. And we wanted a military, a maintenance base there. And I met, while I was there, the grandson of the man that my father made arrangements for the maintenance base back in '46. But they were slow in doing it. The reason we wanted the base was because we had applied for these routes with the CAB. And while it may have seemed overly ambitious, they'd already been to Prague and Warsaw. They had the DC-4s, they had the international experience. They had made the application for close to 59,000 miles of coverage for both cargo and passenger. And we had the people. These are 48 plus people that I haven't found yet, but I'm not finished looking. And we sent the 2 DC-4s to Matson Aviation in Oakland. We were going to have interiors put in them and dump valves. And if the name Matson sounds familiar to you, it is the same company that was the steamship line that were based in California and went to Hawaii. But this is really the beginning of the end of the story, because there's no question that Veterans Air was undercapitalized. In 1945, we turned down outside investors, and later in '46, we did the same thing. The men just didn't want to let loose of the control of the airline. In 1946, when the bill came due with Matson for the airplanes, we didn't have the money to pay them, and we were also arrears in insurance payments. And by May of '47, we were in receivership, and Harvey Stevenson was president of the company. And after a long court battle, Matson actually got the DC-4s, not without paying for them. The ruling from the court was, you don't understand, Matson, these airplanes belong to the US government, and they have the first right of ownership on them. But they went through the battle. It became a precedent-setting case. And then, of course, there's the government and the CAB. Fairly or unfairly, they denied or just ignored our CAB filing, and they needed to protect the majors and their huge investment in them. But in fact, eventually they regulated out of existence over 700 non-SCED companies like Veterans Air over a much more extended period of time. We were in the front end of this, but it was probably took about 20 years for the whole thing to happen. There you have it, as I know it, as I can tell it. The list goes on, and so did the story, but not tonight. You guys have been a great audience. Basically, they saw something in the dream, and they saw it in each other, and they made it happen. And what makes it happen for me to even be able to tell you this story are the families, the librarians. If you don't know your librarian, introduce yourself. They're amazing people. Database and aviation devotees, Embry-Riddle should really be on top of this list. Aviation historians, my website consultant in the UK, and the man of my year every year, my husband, Harry. He's been a huge, huge supporter in all of this. Thank you for coming. I'm sorry I've held you so long.
Great. You want to answer some questions here real quick?
What?
Questions? You want to answer some questions?
Yeah,
If you have a question, please raise your hand so I can bring you the mic. You're pointing at, oh.
I'm just curious why the Holocaust Museum donated or gave to Steven Spielberg, who then gave to you. Why are they in receipt of that?
I don't know the full story behind it. It was a matter of making the film available. And it had nothing directly to do with Spielberg. It was the aftermath of the war, but it was valuable footage. They've got a huge library. And my friend that found this for me, I would never have known how or to look forward to where to find it. But I don't know the direct answer to that. It was just a matter of history being captured.
Yeah, I know Spielberg saves a lot of that material for archiving.
Well, and I think that part of what they did was restored material that existed that maybe the Holocaust Museum had, but it was in bad repair. So it was, I think it kind of went both ways.
Right. Any other questions? I have to say, after watching that, first of all, it's great. It's an amazing snapshot in time right after the war, and one can only imagine what the debriefing was like after those guys went across the Iron Curtain for the first time. I mean, Churchill had just coined the phrase Iron Curtain right at that same time.
Okay.
And, you know, the East and West were establishing that they had a lot of differences, and then to be able to fly in there, my guess is that manifest is missing because they had some people on there that were, you know, observing.
Yes.
There was a lot of
Yeah,
hostility
I wouldn't
going
be
on at that time.
surprised. You got a question?
Okay, hold on a second. We got another one.
How many years have you been studying this?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
How many years have you been studying this?
I started in April of 2015, and I was not aware of any of the databases that I now know about. It was a real, by guess and by golly. And I would find just little things, and then I'd go down that rabbit hole, and I'm kind of infamous for going down rabbit holes because I've got all these wonderful pieces. And the first time I put the information together to make a presentation, I was reading things that were in my files that I had forgotten about. And they didn't make sense to me when I found them, but now down the road, I was able to knit it to this or that or the other, and that's sort of how this whole thing has come about.
What did your father do after the airline went bankrupt?
Thank you. He stayed in aviation. He worked for a company that supported Garrett on the F-84 engines. He became a tech rep. And if I've got my story straight, the F-84s flew in Korea. And we were living in New Jersey, not at the time of Korea, but shortly before that. And his company transferred us to Phoenix. That's how I ended up growing up here. And my dad became a civilian at Luke Air Force Base outside of Phoenix. And then he was sent to Korea as an accident investigator by Garrett and the Air Force, not because they were having incidents where nobody was shooting at the pilot, and yet they were having a problem with the airplane, and they were quite sure it was mechanical, and so they sent him over as a civilian, which is rather unusual, I guess. And then, I'm sorry, and to finish that, he was always involved in aviation in one form or another. He started an aerial photography company. He was teaching me, we were doing Saturday morning ground school when I was a freshman in high school, and then my parents split up. And it took all those years later for me to get airborne again. But aviation was always in his blood, no matter what he did.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Hi.
I wanted to tell you, my father was in the non-skids from the time it started to the time it ended. My father was with Pratt & Whitney, Windsor Locks, Connecticut. He did engines. Then he worked for Great Lakes. He worked for Flying Tigers. He worked for Eastern Airlines, PSA, and then he worked for a guy named Peterson Aerospace. But in his early years, he came to California and worked for Major Mosley. Major Mosley took the military airplanes out of the military and they refitted them with interiors and sold them to the airlines, non-skids, out of Grand Central Airport in Glendale.
That's a great story.
I have a little bit of future, a little more information if you're interested about the ending of the non-skids, because I know about the lawsuit and everything.
I would be very interested. Thank you. Yes.
Anyone else? Well, thank you, Gaylin. That was an amazing presentation.
Thank
One more
you.
round of applause.
Thank you very much. And the website is veteransair.org, all one word, and there's a lot more on it if you're interested. Thank you so much. You've been wonderful.